One of the things that warmed my heart as a medievalist as I watched the Coronation a week or so ago was to see the manuscript of the St Augustine, otherwise known as the Canterbury Gospels, carried in by the master of Corpus Christi College, Cambridge, who are its custodians. This Anglo-Saxon manuscript was taken into the nave of the abbey as the Dean of the Chapel Royal, the Bishop of London, read the Gospel reading. It was then offered to His Majesty the King for him to acknowledge. This is the first time this book has been present at a coronation, and it was, I believe, at the special request of the King, who understands its great significance. It has been to Westminster Abbey before, when it was presented to Pope Benedict XVI in 2010, and it is used at the enthronements of Archbishops of Canterbury in Canterbury Cathedral. This manuscript of the Four Gospels is one of the great cultural artefacts of English Christianity. It dates from the late 6th century, and this was one of the earliest copies of the Gospels to survive in Latin in the whole of Europe. This extraordinary book was present at the very beginning of the conversion of the Anglo-Saxons, and rather miraculously it survived the English Reformation because it was rescued in the 1560s by a Protestant reformer of great foresight. In 595 AD, Pope Gregory the Great chose Augustine, who is the prior of a monastery in the city of Rome, to lead a mission to convert the Anglo-Saxon kingdom of Kent. You've probably heard the old story of how Pope Gregory was inspired to do this while he was walking through the Forum and saw a number of blonde-haired young pagan Anglo-Saxon slaves for sale and asked where they were from, and when he was told they were Angles, he remarked that they looked more like angels and resolved to convert their people. Myth or not, Augustine and 12 companions were dispatched by Pope Gregory, and they arrived in the Kingdom of Kent in 597, and to the court of the then pagan King Ethelbert and his Christian wife Bertha, at what is now Canterbury. The rest, as they say, is history. The manuscript was produced in the late 6th century in Italy, and was either one of the books that Augustine brought with him in 597, or was among the further collection of books sent by Pope Gregory to him in 601. The provenance of the book is nearly faultless. It was certainly in England by the late 7th or early 8th century, when some corrections were made in an Irish insular hand. But by the 10th century, it was with certainty already in the collection of manuscripts at St Augustine's Abbey in Canterbury, the abbey St Augustine had founded himself in 598, and where he was buried. The annotations to the text from the 10th century include references to land grants associated with St Augustine's Abbey. There is also within the volume a 12th century list of relics kept in the abbey church, and in this period, rather than being a functional object, the book was almost certainly kept as a relic due to its association with St Augustine and St Gregory. There is a wonderful manuscript preserved in Trinity Hall, Cambridge. It's a chronicle of St Augustine's Abbey called Speculum Augustinianum. It dates from the early 15th century and was written by a monk called Thomas of Elmham. And it includes a drawing showing the east end of the great abbey church and the high altar of the abbey, with the chapels, tombs and shrines within it. And above the high altar there is shown a ledge, and on it is a central reliquary box containing the relics, the bones of St Ethelbert, the King of Kent who invited Augustine to his kingdom. There are also a couple of hand reliquaries shown there too. And on either side are a row of bound books. The books and missals of Gregory and Augustine, the little abbreviated Latin tag reads. These are the books sent to England by St Gregory with St Augustine in 597, and they were now, 800 years after they'd arrived on these shores, carefully preserved in the church's relics. The St Augustine Gospels is perhaps one of the books we see on this shelf. So for the first 1,000 years or so of its history, this manuscript was at St Augustine's Abbey in Canterbury. Then, of course, the English Reformation began and the monasteries were dissolved by Henry VIII. In July of 1538, the abbot and convent of St Augustine surrendered the abbey to the king's commissioners, and it was dissolved. In 1541, the process began of dismantling the abbey and dispersing the goods, and the library at the abbey and all the books within it were sold off, and for a time the whereabouts of the Gospel book is unclear. However, it resurfaces again in the reign of Elizabeth I. At the beginning of Elizabeth's reign, there was no Archbishop of Canterbury. In 1559, Elizabeth appoints as her Archbishop a man called Matthew Parker. He'd been a career academic at Cambridge, and for 10 years, until the accession of Mary I, when he was removed from office due to his Protestantism, he had been the master of Corpus Christi College. He was a moderate Protestant theologically and a modest and rather bookish sort of man. As soon as he became Archbishop in 1559, he set about, using his newfound influence and wealth, to gather as much as possible for the national good the cream of the dispersed monastic libraries of England. He was particularly interested in collecting Anglo-Saxon manuscripts, as he felt that these documents would justify the Reformers' view that the Protestant Reformation had stripped back later accretions in the Church that were unknown to the Saxons. Matthew Parker had a network of agents who scoured mostly the south of England looking for books, and they bought thousands of both manuscripts and printed works to him from monastic collections, which he then curated into a definitive collection. By the time of his death in 1575, he had 40 Anglo-Saxon manuscripts in his possession, and among them was the St Augustine Gospels. His curated collection was left to Corpus Christi College, Cambridge, with strict rules as to how it should be preserved, and it is still there now in what is called the Parker Library. And that is why the present master of Corpus Christi College held the Gospel book during the coronation. The St Augustine Gospels are written in a clear, bold, Italian, uncial hand. And this is a book not for everyday reading, but one that is designed for liturgical use. It is what in the Middle Ages was called a text or evangelium. It was designed to be used at Mass, at the proclamation, the reading of the Gospel by the deacon, just as it was in some ways at the coronation. It's an interesting text. It is primarily the Latin translation of the four Gospels that was produced in the 4th century by St Jerome and has been known since the 16th century as the Vulgate, but some passages are from the earlier Latin text called the Vetus Latina, the Old Latin Bible. We know that St Gregory the Great at the end of the 6th century was using both translations simultaneously and favoured some passages over others, so it is no surprise really that a text that was probably his gift and was produced in his pontificate should have elements of both standard texts. Originally there were 8 full-page illuminations in the manuscript, but only 2 of these now survive. The others may well have been removed at the time of the dissolution of the monasteries, when the book was in the hands of a dealer. One illumination is a portrait of the evangelist St Luke, and the second has lots of little images of scenes from the Passion of Christ. The full-page illumination of St Luke, which was the page opened at the coronation, shows the evangelist sat under a classical canopy. He is dressed in a Roman toga and holds his gospel in his hands. Above him, in the pediment of the canopy, is his symbol, the winged ox. Above his head is a Latin text taken from the 5th century poem Sedulius's poem on the four Gospels, called Carmen Pascale. It reads, "Luke holds the office of the priesthood with the face of an ox." Down the sides of the canopy are a series of miniatures, biblical scenes taken from the text of Luke's Gospel. On the left-hand side, there is the Annunciation to Zechariah, Christ among the doctors in the temple, there's Christ preaching from a boat, the calling of Peter, the healing of the son of the widow of Nain at the city gate, and the calling of St Matthew. On the right-hand side, there is the healing of the crippled woman, the healing of 10 lepers, the healing of the man with dropsy, and my favourite of all, the calling of Zacchaeus. You can see him hiding up a tree. Then there's the full page with its 12 scenes. At the top we have the entry into Jerusalem, the Last Supper, and the agony in the garden. Below it is the raising of Lazarus. You can see Lazarus tightly bound in his winding sheet, his shroud. Of course, the raising of Lazarus is a type of Christ's resurrection. We have Christ washing the disciples' feet and the betrayal by Judas. And the whole sequence ends with Christ carrying the cross. It is an extraordinary object. It is such a tangible link to the early Christian heritage of these lands and to these pioneers of the Christian faith, Augustine and his fellow Roman missionaries who came here bringing the Christian faith and not knowing entirely what they would find when they arrived. It is upon the foundation of such missionaries and pioneers that our culture is built, and it was rather fitting to have it present at the coronation, a ritual that is nearly as old as this manuscript itself. Thanks very much for watching.